Hello. Welcome to the Liquidity Baking Town Hall, the serious Liquidity Baking Town Hall. This is, well, I guess this started with the tweet that I put out of, do you want to have a town hall on it? Because it was coming up again, as liquidity baking is sort of a perennial topic in the Tezos ecosystem. And I always thought, it was never really properly introduced in the sense that, I think people evolved their own conclusions, which led to other people's other conclusions, and I think it's gotten better over time. But we should. Oh, I always thought we should have like a formal kind of introduction to it, so people understand what it is, why we have it, why it's this net benefit to the ecosystem, and then we can make the best use of it. But yeah, we'll get into all of that. So the people in this town hall, the panelists, attendees, we have Arthur Brightman, co-founder of the Tezos ecosystem, and intellectual fountainhead behind liquidity baking itself. Or one of the people on that paper, we'll call it, that introduced it all. Well, yeah, we'll get into it. Robert Schneider of Tezos Foundation, who's been very instrumental in a very principal component of liquidity baking, which is TZBTC, and has seen it through and the evolution of it and its methodology. Did
we lose Kevin?
Let's see whether North America is coming back.
Oh, there we go. Did people see?
There we go. Now
for a while. Glitchy.
You were introducing Roman and TZBTC.
Yes. So, okay, so that's where you left off. So yes, TZBTC, and so we'll talk more about that. And Dimitri of Cord.fi, which is the first big app of the I guess really coming from liquidity baking itself and the Sirius token, which will explain what that is, and the use of it for leverage liquidity baking. And so we can talk about where that is and its growth and the future of that. So first of all, and just to set the table a little bit more, it's so liquidity baking came to be in 2021. It was conceived by you, Arthur, but the people who it was sort of deployed by the ecosystem in the protocol. It's and maybe you want to explain a bit more like what it does, but it's a source of liquidity. It is the largest source of liquidity in the Tezos ecosystem. We had in many ways a record transaction volume last month. Most of that came from actually liquidity baking and the volume that it brought in, it's so. And the purpose of it, I myself, I was very engaged with it, but I didn't understand until later, really, what the actual purpose of it was. So maybe we want to start with the purpose and the expected net benefit to the ecosystem, and then maybe, how does it work? What is it? How people can get involved?
Yeah, I personally, I would say I don't think I didn't come up with that. I think the people who come up with this type of mechanisms are. I mean, they may not be the first one, but I think of SushiSwap as one of the pioneers in doing that. And the idea behind SushiSwap is they say like, well, we need to compete with Uniswap, but the one thing that matters is liquidity if we want to attract the volume. And so what we'll do is we'll incentivize liquidity providers by giving them our token, and then later that token can capture some fees. There's a similar mechanism that's built into liquidity baking, except it's done with a taste of it. So it's kind of like, can we use the general idea of can we use a little bit of inflation on Tez in order to, subsidize liquidity of the network? And there's probably a non-zero optimal amount to do. And the idea of liquidity, let's start with something that's de minimis, and then potentially grow it if it really works. Potentially not grow it, but a little bit of experiment with it, see what happens, get some learnings from it. Help a little bit grow the DeFi ecosystem, but mostly create this create a bed of liquidity for Tez on the blockchain in a decentralized manner. There's a lot of cool things that play in this. That's the genesis of that. of it all.
So, and you said in an interview, the purpose of it, it's to elevate the status of Tez as a store of value, which I think is something that, whatever someone's a retail holder of Tez, or they're a baker, or whatever they are as a stakeholder, that's something people are, oh yeah, that's a good thing that we can all kind of get behind. So, and that kind of cued in for me not only, so if you could expand on that, because that cued in for me not only just the purpose on its face, but also a lot of other, like it clarified a lot of assumptions and misassumptions that I had, and I think maybe others did too, and also like what could be done with this.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, it goes into like what is money, and then why would you hold money as opposed to holding only you could be holding stocks, instead of using money you could be holding money markets. Why would you hold money, or you could even like hold the set of goods you intend to consume in the future, right? If you know that what, I'm going to buy eggs, I'm going to buy this. Why don't I just buy future on eggs and futures on butter and futures on a house or anything like this? It sounds silly, but it's really it's a really kind of big question, and the reason is that you don't know what you're going to consume in the future, right? So you want to have optionality for the basket of goods you're going to buy in the future. Okay, very well. And the question is like, why should you sit in cash as opposed to holding, say, a market portfolio? And the reason is that, well, if you hold a market portfolio, you're going to have to convert it to cash when you buy something. Like cash is what is going to enable the transaction ultimately. And whenever you get in and out of this position, you're going to pay transaction costs. And the fact that you have these transaction costs mean that you want some cash. And so the rational economic actor approach to this is that you will have a small amount of cash, and then a slightly larger amount of like very liquid assets, and then a slightly larger amount of like less liquid asset, and so on and so forth, where you can have like a scale in terms of the liquidity of the asset that you have, depending on what you expect your short-term needs are to be. This is why, by the way, when you have a crisis, people go to cash. Big disaster like COVID, everyone sells their asset because everyone wants to put cash because they don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainties. They want optionality. When you want optionality, you want cash. Okay. So the definition of cash is like it's really the most liquid. You can look at it as like which making transaction, but it's also the most liquid store of value that you have. So liquidity and in the ability to be converted into different instruments. And store of value kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and so and I think as just a general for people who have no idea what any of the liquidity baking is, and you mentioned sushi swap as a mechanism. So liquidity baking, I mean, it's a DEX contract, like people know from decentralized exchanges. There's a pairing between two assets. There's Tez, and there's the value of Bitcoin in the form of TZBTC. And Robin will explain that a bit more.
Bitcoin.
Yeah, sorry.
It's tokenized Bitcoin, or wrapped Bitcoin.
Wrapped tokenized Bitcoin. It's and fully backed by Bitcoin, and so someone who provides liquidity, they're not just getting transaction fees like you do on any kind of DEX contract. Someone makes a trade, there's a fee that goes to you, but also there's this subsidy that comes from the Tezos protocol itself. There's new Tez being created, and every block that gets shared, that's created and shared amongst the liquidity providers. So it provides something that is, and there's a correlation between, realistically between Tez and Bitcoin. So it minimizes the impermanent loss that people are concerned with adding to a DEX, and also as a added amount is you get this subsidy from the protocol, and it's the largest pool in Tezos today. It's the largest liquidity pool. So maybe we want to get into so what is TZBTC, Roman? Because I think actually the first set of pause that people were like, when this was all introduced, people were kind of like, like that we add something that's not Tez, or like that the protocol is concerned with something that is not Tez, even though realistically all of us are, we people have diverse portfolios, and if you own Tez, you probably own Bitcoin as well. I guess that's pretty common just statistically. But also it's like when you look into a specific blockchain, you assume that there's this sort of self-referential purism to the currency, the native currency in itself. But here we have TZBTC and saying, hey, these two things there's a high correlation between these. Let's have liquidity between this pairing. So, like, what were the thoughts behind TZBTC, and how'd you go about it, like creating it?
And I mean, I think a few of us still remember the time when we discussed, or when there were discussion, what the other asset could be, right? And many may have had, opinions because they had an asset, and it created an importance to a second asset. So what do you take? So you have Tez, that's the no-brainer, and then what's the second one, right? Should you take a US dollar reference? If what US dollar reference? Should you take something else? And I think the importance the pair actually gives to the second asset made it also important to make a choice that has sustainability. And so it's beyond just the Bitcoin as a value, which obviously, Bitcoin as an asset type is something that is interesting, for one. And you mentioned the correlation advantages you may have with Bitcoin to Tez compared to a dollar to Tez, for example. But I think one other very important puzzle, for me at least, was always that you needed to have something that was where you had certainty that there is a very close connection to the Tezos ecosystem. What I mean by that is, we do have, for example, natively Tether on Tezos, but Tether is as a product controlled by a third party, and their interests may not always perfectly align with Tezos, but this is something that actually happens on chain. And so to have TZBTC as a second part of the liquidity baking, choosing the value of Bitcoin, which emotionally I think is very positive to many of us, and B, that is very close to the ecosystem, so there is an element of control or sustainability here that was important. And then, I think TZBTC, for those who don't know it, it was a very early project. It happened in 2019, 2020, and then it launched in 2020. The idea was to create a Bitcoin on Rails, right? As we all know, you need to have some form of contract reference to a Bitcoin in order to use it for DeFi or to use it on chain. And so TZBTC was already, I'd say, pretty established at that point in time. I remember it was one of the first FA1-2 contracts that were launched, and you had the key holder. So it has a key holder gatekeeper mechanism. So you have like a multi-sig, imagine a multi-sig with a 3 out of 5 logic, and the 5 key holders are not just kind of anonymous parties, but it's regulated key and custodians that take on that responsibility. And then you use gatekeepers as a distribution mechanism, and we can talk about the effectiveness of those mechanisms later. I think it improved now, but it was a difficulty at the beginning. But it was an asset that was close to the Tezos ecosystem, that had a good emotional fit, if I may say, and so that made it the second part. To that liquidity pool that actually was a fantastic idea to spark DeFi on Tezos, because the incentive is not just for the pair, and Dimitri will talk more about it later, right? You start to have an incentive somewhere, and then people can start using and renting that incentive for their own applications, which gives them growth. And we've seen a lot of growth in people using TZBTC, but also the LB token, the liquidity token, the LP token of the pair.
Yeah, and maybe speak. Oh, go ahead, Arthur.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of points on this. One important aspect of the selection of the assets is the correlation to DEX, and I can explain that. So the downside to DEXs compared to, it's a true problem. It exists in DEXs. It also exists in order book systems. It exists in centralized trading. Is the market makers? They're always a little bit a sitting duck, right? When you're market making, when you're providing liquidity, someone will know something that you don't know. They will move faster, and they will take your liquidity whenever it's like you. And that's very much the case in a Uniswap V2 type of contract. So same, like a curve-based, like constant product market maker, which is what the curve for liquidity baking is. That means that a lot of the trades are going to be just like, you see the price on the exchange, prices move, and then you come and arbitrage on the chain. And that is called sometimes impermanent loss. And by providing liquidity to this pool, you are getting a bunch of impermanent loss all the time. And so you have to compensate people for that loss. And that can become compensated by fees, or it can become compensated by a subsidy. Now, the impermanent loss that you have, it is not exactly proportional, but it grows with the volatility of the pair that you have. So less volatile the pair is, nothing happens to the price. You don't have that much impermanent loss. The more volatile it is, the more impermanent loss you have. The formula is, if you're math inclined, is the exponential of minus sigma squared over 8, where sigma is your volatility. So you can see it as like plus sigma squared over 8. So it increases exponentially with volatility. So the lower the volatility, the less you're going to have to subsidize. And so Tezos, the Tez BTC exchange rate historically is less volatile than the Tez USD exchange rate, and that's true of pretty much every cryptocurrency out there. So as a result, it costs you less to subsidize liquidity on Tez between Tez and Bitcoin than it does between Tez and USD, even if there's more demand for trading in one. As I said, so you might say, well, yes, but what if I want to get to USD? And then the point is like, well, sure, but there exists very, very, very deep pools of liquidity between BTC and USD. Like those already exist. So therefore, you're better off, like having this done off-chain, centralized exchanges to conversion from BTC to USD if it needs to happen, versus on-chain where the impermanent loss is going to be highest. You want to be paired with an asset that's high. And it's less convenient if people just see it as like a way to do DeFi. I think a lot of people will say, well, it's less convenient. I do DeFi. I want to convert to USD in terms of this. It's less convenient. But if the point is to create a liquidity arbitrage, so that market makers, wherever they are, you could be a market maker on a centralized exchange, whatever, can offload their risk by using this contract. Then you're bringing more liquidity to the asset ultimately. So it's a more efficient way.
Yeah, and I think especially this moment in time right now, might even be the first moment where we can really see the truest benefit of that, because this is the moment when market psychology, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, Bitcoin is starting to boom, I should be all in on Bitcoin. But then they're seeing the rapid rise of Tez over the last month or so, and they're like, wait a minute, maybe there's more upside in Tez, but then I got to get in Bitcoin. No, I'm going to come back in Tez. And it's like, well, the underlying thing here is you're kind of putting your funds in the crypto market, and like you're betting on crypto growing in value. And so you're getting it on both by adding to a liquidity pool that's a pairing between both. And then there's maybe this offset that also comes with the subsidy that helps as well, plus the transaction fees of volatility between the two. So maybe,
It's true. It's about true. And on the liquidity providing side, you might say like, oh, well, it means that the liquidity provider needs to be exposed to Bitcoin. But I would imagine the vast majority of people who have some exposure to, who hold some Tez, probably also hold some Bitcoin, probably have some exposure to Bitcoin already. It's not like it's not a far cry to imagine that they also own some Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrencies. Might be different ratios or different like this, but most people who hold Tez also hold some other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, and the top two traded pairs, if you look at, or just centralized exchanges and that data with Tez, the top is with USD with Tether, but of course that's the permanent loss exposure that people have, and but then the second is with Bitcoin, and there are so many people see and price how they price Tez in terms of Bitcoin. So it's so native to the market that we know in the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, I do think it makes sense. It's kind of because you want to when you want to look at these things, you want to remove exogenous components, exogenous factors. So in some sense, when you look at the Tez BTC exchange rate, you are removing some of the general crypto factor. So it's a way of removing there's two components. One is how well Tez is doing in the exchange rate, and the other one is how well Bitcoin is doing. You kind of want to separate the two things because the correlation is still quite high.
And for a lot of people, depending on the season, they'll think of it in their head as one or the other. but certainly probably the largest market within like crypto, like the lowest hanging fruit, effectively. I mean, it's people who are Bitcoin holders. I mean, that is the dominant force. And Roman, back to that, and what you're saying about like the trusted institutions that are a part of this, that are behind securing TZBTC and its collateral and its key holders, and how has it evolved from TZBTC 1.0 versus 2.0? Because it's not a new TZBTC contract. It's the same contract. It's the methodology of minting and redeeming it.
Yeah. So the difficulty we had for quite some time was that the gatekeeper function didn't really provide meaningful liquidity to users, and it's still, obviously you get your TZBTCs on chain, but if you wanted to get them from gatekeepers, you needed to have a certain size, which means that for, let's say, a foundation, it may not have been a problem to get TZBTC, but for an individual, it may well have been. If that individual then probably lived overseas and looking at it from Switzerland, it may have been even more difficult. So one of the things we try to fix is to ease the access and to automate the access on the gatekeeper side. That was a big part of that revamping, and obviously with that you needed to look at the minting and burning as well, right? Initially it was a very, very static process where the key holders would meet and there is some form of ceremony where they have a procedures and they would review, and so they probably do it once a month if there is need. And now we're in a setup where you have kind of like two segregated pools, if you want, so or structures, where one is relatively static, or you may call it cold, or and then there is one that is automated, so that minting and burning would happen automatically based on gatekeeper requests. So Arthur wants a TZBTC, Arthur brings a Bitcoin, requests a rep, and that would then trigger a mint directly. So that was one portion, and then obviously we've discussed that already. The question is how do you grow it, because growing obviously helps liquidity, and the more liquidity you have, the easier it becomes for people to get it, and there is still, as we see also in the comments, right, there is still growth potential obviously where we're at the moment. So growing TZBTC, growing access to Tezos DeFi obviously is very important. Maybe there was one question I saw in there, and it kind of moves up, which is like someone was asking why we chose the name Cirrus, or why the name Cirrus was chosen. And coming from TZBTC to Liquidity Baking, I remember that there was a time when people started to list assets, and there were discussions and what assets should be listed, and the liquidity pool, or the LP token from Liquidity Baking obviously gives you access to the performance of the vehicle without actually having the requirement to provide liquidity. And so we said, okay, I mean, I'm saying we, but I was.
It's not why it's called Cirrus. It's called Cirrus because Cirrus is a binary star system.
Yes, exactly.
It's two stars orbiting each other.
Yeah,
the two stars are Tezos and Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And
that's why it's called Cirrus. It was also a cool name. And yeah, the idea was that instead of having people, need to like, if you just directly list a Cirrus token on a centralized exchange, people can go and buy it directly. And if the price of the token decouples from like the amount of liquidity that's in the pools, then there's a clear arbitrage where you just basically like, put liquidity in the pool, create the token, sell the token, right? And so it gave a way of people to participating even more simply than actually having to go and interact with a smart contract or do any of this.
Yeah, and there was kind of that branding came in, or that rebrand, let's call it, came in 2022 or like several months later. So originally it was, and if you look at the contract today, even what we call the Sirius token, like if you look at it in Explorer, it'll call it like LQT or LBT, LQT instead of SIRS. But
it was at a time when we still had Bittrex.
Yeah, yeah. But we're just beginning, you know. I mean, there's a long way to go with this. But maybe that brings into, now that we're into Sirius. So to clarify, I mean, people still call liquidity baking because it's a gerund, so it's a process, whereas Sirius is like Sirius Exchange. It's a kind of a term for it all, and it's also the token itself. And then the symbol of that token is SIRS. And so what came later is, and the idea is that we can extend this resource, this token, which represents not only a liquidity position, but also what would be a subsidy for the holder, that this continuing amount. So they get money off the transaction fees. It's three things. I mean, it relates to this amount of the liquidity being that's in there in the contract, but also I think people can see it as like some expected value for the subsidy that would come in, but also the transaction fees that are accumulated from people trading between these two assets, TZBTC and XTZ. And that makes it very unique, a very unique value source, and I think can really bring in the interest of people maybe who are maybe Bitcoiners and purist Bitcoiners, but who are maybe curious of other types of assets. And it kind of gives them this valve, this mechanism to come in and say, maybe there is this great upside in here. So Dimitri, as the creator of the first like true dApp wholly surrounding liquidity baking and Sirius, maybe you want to introduce cord.fi. That's KORD.fi for people who want to look it up, and how that came to be.
Yeah, sure, Kevin. So we built CordFi, which is a leverage farming protocol on top of liquidity baking contract. So as we've discussed earlier today, so liquidity baking is basically Uniswap v2 like AMM contract, which is subsidized by the Tezos protocol inflation. So the quite unique part is that the subsidy is done on the protocol level and not discretionary, like in case of sushi and many others, of course. So the idea was that while the Sirius or liquidity baking LP token, it gives you exposure to two assets, which is Tezos and TZBTC. The idea was that some users who may want to have exposure only to one of these assets, so either Bitcoin or Tezos, or they might want to leverage their exposure to this token. And for this reason, we actually built the leveraged farming protocol CordFi. So it basically allows for kind of user segmentation. So if some users are more conservative, they can just lend their Tez or TZBTC and earn a small interest. And if they are more kind of more aggressive and want to earn higher returns, they can actually borrow Tez or TZBTC from the lenders and enjoy higher returns. So right now you can earn up to you can leverage the liquidity baking LP token up to 5 times, which can give you 3-digit returns, but you also get a higher impermanent loss in case price moves.
Yeah, and that's great for. I mean, I think always, but especially now, you have a surge of people who are always watching the markets, and then they're seeing what to bet on short term, midterm, and really, and their bottleneck is just finite resources. So leveraging, not only so they get in on liquidity baking, they get in on Sirius, and then they can leverage TZBTC. They can borrow some amount of it, or they can borrow more Tez, and they can use that for whatever their purposes are, trading, swap for something else. It's whatever their own strategy is of what they want to do. So yeah, and that's growing. I mean, it has one of the largest TVLs in, I think it's the third largest of the ecosystem. Sirius and Uves being the top two, and it's Cord.fi.
I mean, if we, Dimitri and I found that really interesting at the time when you worked on Cord, and we've been kind of, also working with youths, and we considered whether the Sirius token or the I think it was called LB token at that time kind of had a value in collateral, and you kind of got it a bit because it could be a playful. People could kind of, decide to, let's say, short the Bitcoin portion of it, and kind of, or leverage, get a leverage position, and therefore, increase the yield you get from liquidity baking. And, in that DeFi kind of environment, sometimes to have a product market fit is a bit of a guessing game. You don't know what kind of sparks interest. But then Sirius was like, it was a no-brainer. We put it in, and we were like, yeah, let's see what happens. And then the DAO, that account said, let's go for it. And it grew really quickly. And now when you see how much volume in collateral there is from people, and using the Sirius token, it's quite impressive. So this was really a use case people liked, whether they wanted to leverage or hedge one part of the equation. And that's what I meant before by renting that part. Without liquidity baking, there would have been far less growth there because of its non-existence, right? That was quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think that circles back to, and I think this kind of answers some of the comments. How do we, maybe it's for Arthur, how do we measure the success of liquidity baking? Because I think to a lot of people it's subjective, and no matter how well it does, you could say no, it's not enough, so how do we measure it? How do we measure its success?
So there's what you can measure. There's what matters. They don't always exactly intersect. I'll tell you what might not make sense. So looking a lot at on-chain volume doesn't tell you all that much, because a lot of that on-chain volume is going to come like strictly from arbitrage. So you'll see a lot of volume when there's like a bunch of volatility. That's not good volume. It's like that's actually like that. That's the cost of having it. But the point of liquidity baking is not to be like this super useful facility that everyone will use on chain and so on and so forth. If it does that, that's great. That is not what it is designed for. The point is, like, imagine you're a market maker on SX, for example. You're making a market. You have an inventory in Tez. You want to hedge your inventory. You can go and hedge on liquidity baking, and that's going to look like an arbitrage. Right? It's going to look like just like, oh, I'm arbitraging the price. But essentially, the way that liquidity works is like when you have pockets in liquidity in different markets, what market makers will do is that it will take liquidity in one market and then like pipe it into another one. So essentially, that's what it does. And you're not going to see this if you're only trying to look at like, are people active in DeFi on Tezos using this and so on and so forth. That's not going to show up. It's just very, very mechanical. Let's say you have someone trades on Binance. All of a sudden, there's like there's they're selling, for example, on Binance. There's a gap of liquidity. Price gets stored because it just like goes through the market immediately. This opens up an arbitrage with liquidity baking, where liquidity baking is going, like anyone who's doing this arbitrage is going to basically move liquidity from liquidity baking to Binance. So you can think of liquidity being piped through different exchanges, and so the best, one measure to this is like, how deep is it, and that you can get a good answer. You can get like a good answer for is like, you're paying this much in subsidy. This is how much impermanent loss is. So in reality, like how much liquidity are you baking for that? Are you getting for this? I haven't checked those numbers lately. When we launched, they were bad in a sense that like liquidity baking was quite profitable. And a measure of the success of liquidity baking is that liquidity baking should be as unprofitable as possible. That's a good measure of success. It's not enough, because it could be that, all right, we've achieved the goal of having a deep pool of liquidity, but it's not a capital efficient one, and actually maybe like market makers don't know about it and they don't connect to it. There's no arbitrage happening. So I would say, like, how well arbitrage is it? That's an important one. Like, how quickly does it react to moves? How deep is it? Those are pretty good metrics of success. How much of an impact does it have broadly on like Tez being like a store value? Very, very hard to measure. And I think it's why the amount is so small. Like, if you knew for a fact that this works, like that somehow like it has a massive impact, then you could say like, all right, it's not making 0.5%, it's making like 2-3%, 4%, see what happens. But it's really hard to tell. You could try experiments, like run it for a while, but there's just so many variables. It's so noisy that it's really, really hard to tell. So you kind of have to guess a little bit on first principle, unfortunately. But yeah, the one thing you can measure is profitability, and like the profitability should be almost, none. And you can see this by saying like, one interesting metric is like, does the Sirius token outperform both Tez and Bitcoin? Like, is it better to hold like like if you had a basket of like Tez and Bitcoin and you were balance it every day to have the same value, how much better is like the Sirius token than that? And you can get a sense from this of like how efficient it's being. I suspect it could be more efficient because I look at the yields on like PortFi and they're still quite high. So I think there's like this. You don't need tons and tons of people doing like writing liquidity baking. You just need enough. Like you just need enough competition that it drives the yields fairly low. Although the thing is like anyone who's willing to do DeFi today, there's just so many yields opportunities everywhere that the yields have to be high, in a way, in order to be competitive.
Sure. In terms of like if a baker and they want to see the value of this to the ecosystem or to them as a holder, or and they're looking at, and it's probably like an over pronounced reaction, but the subsidy, the added inflation that comes with this subsidy, which it's I believe it was at least 0.3%, which is very marginal considering the natural rate of growth of Tez supply. Like it's not even, by some measure, it's not even really worth even like getting up in arms about.
You have the price of Tez with like plus 10%, minus 10%.
Right. It's not.
It's like it is like plus 0.3% over a year. That's really going to make the difference.
Yeah. And there's two things. There's an offset, and I think a lot of people either don't know about this or they forget about this. But for the half the transaction fee for when people trade on this, it burns. It goes to a burn account, and that in part and potentially in full can offset that subsidy. So I mean, for one thing, if the more people are trading with liquidity baking, the more that offset becomes. In fact, technically it could become a deflationary mechanism to which you win
a lot of like if somehow people find it like super convenient, and then it's just not just about like liquidity, but like actually people want to engage with it. In that case, yes, you could get to you could get to that. You could get to that point. Let me check. There's a burn. You can check the burn address, and it's pretty much the only thing that like is really using that burn address. So it will give you some sense of like. But I forget what is a zero key essentially. But it can be found.
Yeah, and I think in general, just as long as it's understood, or I think people will maybe like there's a principle of it. It's like, well, I don't want this if it's, why should we have this? It's if the net benefit exceeds the cost, if the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, I mean, you have a net value there.
My point is like at the margin, you should have a bias for openness and trying stuff, and keeping options open and seeing what's going on. I think keeping options, I value a lot of options, right? Keeping options open, you never know. You can keep an eye on it, which is why I don't think we're getting like tremendous value, to be honest, from liquidity baking today. I think we're getting more value from it existing at all rather than from it being big. And so for me, if I had to like, if people were like, say like, no, this is cost way too much, I would say, okay, cut the cost. Like it's way better, for example, to like keep liquidity baking existing and cutting the cost by like 2x, 3x, rather than just like completely not having it. Okay, so to date, it's not that much. To date is about 220,000 Tez that have been burned through this.
Okay.
Maybe I see it even simpler. I think, the protocol will have some inflation to pay certain aspects, right? One is validation, another one may be closely linked or closer linked to DeFi activity. At the end, you want activity on chain and it will benefit by means of higher number of users, etc. And you need to find that growth somewhere. So you find different pockets of interest to some people, and sometimes there may be a way to have a little bit larger pools. And yes, 65 Bitcoin is not much, but it's 6.5 million, and I think there is not so many pools on Tezos with 6.5 million, and so maybe that's interesting enough for someone to kind of dip his toe in, and we can say, look, let's just focus on art and only do art on Tezos. But then maybe someone wants to sell an NFT, and therefore they need some form of DEX, and DEX is an infrastructure that kind of comes from DeFi. So I think it's sometimes if you look at it more like kind of like an ecosystem or a digital commonwealth, you pay incentives for different things. You're in an early stage, and obviously an important part of the incentive scheme goes to validation to make sure the blockchain does what it's supposed to do. But if there is a portion that we can spare for incentives and that trigger activity, I think we should absolutely do it.
Is it possible? Oh, go ahead, Dimitri. Yeah.
I'd also add that it kind of, so of course it helped to grow the DeFi. So I think it accounted almost to half DeFi TVL in some way, like not direct, but like just because it exists and it allowed to build products around it. And secondly, I think it also gives us correlation to BTC. So it's a large pool. So something along the lines Arthur mentioned. But this is a large UniV2 like pool with Bitcoin, which gives positive correlation with the Bitcoin price, which is quite helpful in some kind of markets like we have right now. So.
Yeah, and Dimitri, have you had any thoughts on like how can this, as creator of a dApp that surrounds leveraging Sirius, I mean, how can the overall mechanism lead to the growth of liquidity and perhaps other assets? Because how can it trickle into affecting and growing other assets, or can it?
So I'd say we could experiment with the kind of DEX types. So current liquidity baking was built around Uniswap v2 like AMM, which is not the most efficient that we have right now. So like subsidizing pairs on order book DEXs, or you need to concentrate liquidity. AMMs would be more efficient probably. And another thing would be that like initially we had some difficulties with accessibility of TZBTCs. So like ideally, if we could allow a permissionless swapping into the token linked with Tez, that would really help, because in that case, the new liquidity would come into ecosystem through this pair.
So it's a conversion from BTC to TZBTC is not permissionless as a KYC, but it is quite open, and the tickets are quite small now. And all you need really is like enough openness that you'll have arbitrage happening, so that then if people want to switch to TZBTCs, they can actually use Liquidity Baking, which has a bunch. We haven't touched so much on like improvements, but I think there's a lot of ways that the thing could be improved. One is like Uniswap v2 is not very capital efficient, and there's two ways you can make it more capital efficient. You could try to like change the structure, so have something like Uniswap v3, or have a limit order book for this. The downside of this approach is that you lose the ability of having like a simple token like Sirius. Like you lose that, but you get way more capital efficient. And the second option is to do a target DEX. And a target DEX is basically you have an oracle tell you the XTZ BTC exchange rate from some exchange. So it's more brittle, a little more centralized, but then you can automatically concentrate the liquidity, and then you get to keep a single token as an LP position. So that's probably like it's also simpler to audit and implement. So that's probably a strong option to have a target DEX. It doesn't immediately mean, by the way, that you get like all of a sudden way more liquidity, because the target DEX is going to have more impermanent loss. So in some sense, like the liquidity will fall a bit, but you have the liquidity where it matters. You don't have a bunch of Tez that's missing out on staking or like other opportunities. That's number one. And number two, that could be done is having instead of having an on-off switch, have a dial where people can like where BIC is essentially like the same way they have a gas dial for Ethereum, where the validator is essentially in a block. You can say like, let's increase it a little bit, let's decrease it a little bit, and then you take a median of that, and that gives you like the level where it is, so that you can, within a window, say maybe it's at 0.3% or something like that today, and so you can say like, well, I want it a little higher, a little lower, and that way you can delegate it. If you like it's helpful, you can increase it. If you feel it's not helpful, you can decrease it, as opposed to having a binary outcome.
Yeah, and I believe you described it, Arthur, as like islands, and the largest island is this pair between Bitcoin and Tez, and you can have roads to the nearby islands, which are obvious sources of liquidity.
The other thing is like, oh yeah, we could also move it to if we wanted. It's actually possible to move it to Etherlink if we wanted. There's pros and cons to that. The cons is like it's good to have this activity on the layer 1. We want to keep having activity on the layer 1. It feels like a core thing, but in principle, there's nothing that stops the subsidy that's being minted to basically like be deposited automatically on Etherlink. And the benefit of that would be that because Etherlink is getting way more connectivity with other DeFi ecosystem in terms of like layer 0 bridges and all of that, potentially you get more people into it. So that would be also a potentially interesting thing to do with it. Certainly if and when certainly with Tezlink, which is a Tezos compatible rollup, it would make sense to at the minimum move it to Tezlink, where you have lower block time.
Would we move it, or would we bridge it? Whereas the value source maybe starts on the L1 and then gets encapsulated over as now you have access to this thing.
If you want, if you wanted, so if you have a Uniswap V2 DEX, the block time doesn't really matter in terms of the arbitrage. It's like even as the block time goes to 0, your impermanent loss stays the same. It's not the case, I think, with the target DEX. I think with the target DEX, the longer your target is stale, the worse it's going to be, and so you do benefit from having a faster block time in terms of being able to update it. And so since the sequencers and the rollups are giving you a sub-second block time, it would be a bit more efficient. To be honest, the reason it's not been like, I propose these ideas. If anyone wants to implement them and like integrate them into the core protocol, that'd be more than welcome. The two reasons it's not been a priority is like, number one, there's a lot on the plate of the core developers in terms of the Tezos X roadmap, scaling the chain, all of that, and Liquidity Baking has generally like been a small thing. But the second thing is it's a Pandora's box because of like to be honest, a lot of history of fighting around it. And so there's a notion that every single time you touch it, you're going to reopen the Pandora's box, and it's just a mess. And so I think that has led to I would say a reluctance to touch it.
Right.
Which is too bad, because I think there's a few, definitely like target DEX would be an improvement.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that the conversation has been swinging towards improving liquidity baking and baking Benjamins. He mentioned that as a question of how can it improve it, and there's a thread on Agora where there are ideas being thrown around there too, and people should go to Tezos Agora and check that out and participate in that discussion. But yeah, I on the history of fudding, because that's something that's come up, and it tends to be like I think it goes back to people just not really being clear on the purpose or being able to connect it to how they see value in protocol upgrades or features in the ecosystem, that it just becomes sort of a vehicle for angst, particularly in times bad. And also I think what I would say is, like, I've noticed, I mean, there had been some changes in like where maybe there is like a shut off mechanism where if enough bakers switch that, then the whole thing would. And that has been lowered over time, the threshold. But I think once my issue with that is like once that's established, then I think that just becomes a target for people to, and like as opposed to thinking, wait a minute, maybe it's a good thing. They're just become maybe more fixated on that target, and maybe they forget like why they were even against it at all, or if that even matters anymore. They're just like committed to that road because that's the protocol method.
I think a lot of people say like, So a lot of people will say like, "Oh, it's inflation," and so, but the funny thing is, like, no one's complaining like, "Oh, there's 16% for staking. That's fine. It attracts people to Tezos. It's all good."
Right.
It's like the 0.3% on liquidity baking. We're being robbed.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea somehow that there was like this, this shadow conspiracy of people benefiting from liquidity baking, and this, it's so open. Anyone can come in and buy the Series token or add this thing. It's true that the friction with CZPTC was very unfortunate. It was resolved, but aside from that, it's a pretty open thing. I think on the balance, it's net positive in the sense that from the activities that it creates in DeFi, all that. Oh, one more thing. Sometimes people say, "Oh, well, why aren't there more front ends? Why can't it be surfaced?" I think it would be nice to have more front ends for it, like more visibility. At the same time, the number one front end for liquidity baking today is called 3Route.
Yeah.
Because and honestly, I think a lot of the future of DEXs is going to be through aggregators, because aggregators can be quite efficient. A lot of people don't necessarily want to use a particular DEX. Some traders might want to they want to place like very specific orders, or want to their orders treated in a very specific way. But most people who want to swap, they don't care. I mean, it blows my mind that people will pay 75 basis points to swap on MetaMask just out of the convenience. What most people want is convenience. And so long as you have liquidity somewhere, DEX aggregators will find a way.
Yeah. And on Tezos.io, you can do it, and you can also add and remove liquidity there, which I don't believe you can do on Route. So that's our realigned strategy with Tezos to really start with liquidity baking as the largest pool in Tezos, and to move outward from there and incorporate and aggregate liquidity strategies that would be able to just provide more convenience in a different way than 3Route aggregation. But yeah, and I think going back to, I think the people, like there will be conspiracy theories and whatnot, and maybe this goes back to, because people throw on things like, oh, well, Bitcoin and it's collateralized in Switzerland. Oh, it's Switzerland TF and all those things, and like it's very easy to, whereas like, no, these things are done for your security. That's not what. Why does your mind immediately go to there?
The very first discussion on this started with like I suggested, oh, let's just use a Dexter contract, and what I meant by that was like, we'll just use whatever code Dexter is using. And by the way, it is in reviewing this code that we saw there were some issues with the Dexter code, and people were like, "That's not fair. Why Dexter? Why not keep your swap? It's not fair to keep your swap." Yeah. Like, it's just a
there's a lot of that too.
Benefit either, It's
in some sense here. But if you look at it differently, in some sense, that's kind of like a positive sign, right? It just shows that people smell an economic benefit, and they're kind of trying to make sure that they're not kind of like left out. So yes, to some extent, greed, in some ways fuels activities. So it's okay, right? I mean, it's clearly worse if no one actually talks about it. So I remember the discussions when there was like the worry that because the contract with the name A was used, then that team that was linked to the to that contract then kind of got some form of funding or money. I mean, there's a very, 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 very simple reason why the custodians were predominantly in Switzerland initially. It was just because you had to explain so much to them what they actually should do, that proximity was of the essence, right? So if you cross the street and you talk to Bitcoin Swiss and tell them what exactly you want to do, and at the beginning, I mean, all the kind of legal regulatory questions that also kind of popped up, they were just much easier to discuss. And actually, a guy called Armin Schmid at that time at Bitcoin Swiss, he did a lot of work in order to bring it to life. I think it was also the guy that worked a lot on Tezos State initially at Bitcoin Swiss. So you needed those people that were interested in the ecosystem, again, to what I said before, to push it, and so proximity helps, but then also obviously link generally their connection to Tezos, to the founder, etc. And so you have Hex nowadays, obviously not in Switzerland. You have Tangani, obviously not in Switzerland. So that's how it was.
I visited the Tezos Foundation offices in 2019, and yeah, it's like literally across the street. I mean, there were events being held where people from Bitcoin Suisse coming to the Zug events and all of that. So I mean, yeah, there is something to an element of having that direct conversation, that element of like this shared control and reliability. Whereas, I've been looking at Tether, and they've pulled out like half their chains over the last year and a half, in a way. So it's not like they're like, as you said, Arthur, like their interests might not necessarily be aligned with that of the ecosystem. And moreover, I think it also, the fact that we do have like more sources and access points for onboarding, I think that helps. But I mean, I've noticed that when there's a financial incentive, people will jump through hoops. Like they will go and they will do that. And also we always think a lot about like friction of liquidity in, but we don't. I think what's always understated is just so that I think there's overstatement of that because people will go to a financial incentive, but it's also equal to liquidity out, and people have implicit desire to keep their liquidity in once it's in, or that like it's like, give me a reason, I don't want to have to go and do a thing. And unless they absolutely have to, it's like, okay, I have to get this out of here. So in that way, I mean, there's kind of a there's a benefit to people coming to a sovereign L1.
If you want a little bit of history around TZBTC, way before Liquidity, like the reason it was created at first. So it was early 2019, and it wasn't clear what would happen to crypto exchanges, specifically, like in the US in particular. But there was this idea that if there's going to be any crypto exchange at all, at least they'll list Bitcoin. Like the asset most likely to stay listed on most exchanges is going to be Bitcoin. And what a lot of US people were doing was they would use they would have the banking on ramp for Bitcoin, and then they would use non-US Bitcoin only, like no fiat deposit exchanges. So they would buy their Bitcoin and then sell their Bitcoin to this other platform and then trade over there. And so as a hedge against this type of scenario, the idea was you create a wallet, you make it the best Bitcoin wallet, which was a good strategy in 2019 because all the Bitcoin wallets, like for mobile, were absolutely terrible. Create the best Bitcoin wallet, make it also a Tezos wallet, and then make it so that with one button, if you hold some Bitcoin, it can be wrapped into TZBTC via an atomic swap. So you create a button, it would like execute automatically an atomic swap, give you wrapped Bitcoin on Tez, and then with another click, use a DEX to transform it into Tez. So it was like a Bitcoin and Tez wallet, and then with one click, if you own Bitcoin, then you have your Tez. So it would have essentially decoupled Tez from any exchange. It's not a strategy or anything like that. But if you're a chain like Monero, for example, and you had smart contracts, which you don't, that's probably the type of feature you would want to build in as a way to decouple you from a lot of this stuff. So that was the idea. So the thing that were needed was one a wallet. It unfortunately did not happen. TZBTC, which did happen, and a Uniswap v2 DEX. But we were on to like the importance of Uniswap in early 2019. Execution issues, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that is, I guess that's still a desire to have the sort of the seamless, universally seamless ability to have an atomic swap between Tez and wrapped Bitcoin, which we're getting closer to.
Have become a bit difficult. You've seen, for example, AtomX, like stop their atomic swap ideas, and now you have other ways to do this than atomic swap, which have become popular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did it. We had the first run of it with Tezos. Well, we called it Bridge, which now is a confusing name. But we had an interchain atomic swap peer-to-peer, and that worked well for Ethereum to Tezos. We didn't, I guess we can use Bitcoin now and be able to bring that into a swap with Tezos. The mechanism, the same. People want to do it. It's definitely a large liquidity source. And but with TZBTC 2.0, I think we've come a lot closer in which people are able to access something that, it feels like, an exchange. It feels like the exchange that they know. and they can go from Bitcoin to TZBTC and back. It's not like there is KYC, so it's not a fully trustless thing where people can do it peer to peer, privately, for people who don't want to do that. And it's not available in every jurisdiction. I can't use it in the US. But we're getting closer, and this is a process. So, I mean, these are part of the improvements that come in, these modular improvements that have stepped in. I think that also answers some of the questions being asked in that regard too.
With some of the political changes we're seeing, maybe
Yeah,
a assessment of the regulatory risks may be worthwhile. Who knows?
yeah.
Maybe there is more.
Yeah, that would be great.
There's some nice thing about the setup of TZBTC, which was Roman. You can tell more about it because like you'll have you know more precisely the approvals that were obtained for the TZBTC setup.
I think the advantage of having an automated KYC. So the goal was to bring the minting and burning down to or below an hour. Obviously, if you do it with certain institutional players, obviously KYC won't go away, and if you have KYC requirements, you also have certain restrictions, as you said, Kevin. But it did automate the process, and we've seen what it did. Right, you had a gap between TZBTC and BTC price for quite some time, and that went away, but also the number of transactions obviously went up because people could use it and did use it. It works really well now. I mean, initially there was a couple of teething issues, but looking at it, it works really well. And I mean, I also look forward to see what it may bring. I mean, TZBTC will be on Etherlink soon. Really soon, I guess. Ethereum was discussed as well. Who knows? Maybe it will slightly change the name at one point in time to make it more, cross-chain related. Because it does what we discussed also in another context before. It does offer a door into an ecosystem, and I think that's important in order to have growth.
Mm-hmm.
I have to hop off.
I think we're at an hour. So
we're a little over an hour, yeah.
If there are any last words everybody wants to give, one thing you want to know about, you want people to know about any of this, about serious liquidity baking, the future?
I think we discussed it, right? But thank you very much, Kevin, for moderating it as well. And thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Great. Yeah.
Great town hall. Thank you, everybody. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.